Well, good morning, everybody. How we doing this morning? Yeah, great. So good to hear. If you're a guest, my name is Michael. I'm one of the pastors here. Super pumped to be with you guys as always, as a family, to get to open up God's word together, to be more molded and made into the image of Jesus. And we are starting a new series today. We're taking a break from studying the book of Acts for a little while. We've been studying the book of Acts since January, but we're going to hit the pause button on that and come back to it later this fall. But the series we're starting today is actually going to take us through this weekend, which was Serve the City weekend. Did anybody participate in Serve the City weekend? Yes, some of you. Few, good, that's great. Serve the City weekend was a weekend where members from across our family of churches gave their time, energy, and effort to love and serve folks in our community. We had a bunch of people serve. It was absolutely fantastic. But this series is going to get us through Serve the City weekend all the way to Easter. And the goal for it, honestly, is to give us a few weeks to set our minds and our hearts on Jesus. As we prepare to celebrate his victorious resurrection, the fact that he is alive, to give us the opportunity to set our minds and hearts on the life that he lived, on what he accomplished for us, and what all of that actually means for us now. And honestly, the imagery for it actually comes from where we left off last week in Acts chapter 8 with Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. So if you'll remember, last week we saw that the eunuch was reading the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, specifically a portion of Isaiah from Isaiah 53. And we said that it was one of 4 or 5 sections of Isaiah, often referred to as the servant songs. There are these texts that describe a figure known as the servant of God, or the Eved Yahweh in Hebrew. And we saw that this figure, he perplexed the eunuch. For one reason or another, the eunuch was drawn to this servant of God, but was in some respects a little surprised and confused by what he read. And I think it's fair to say that this figure was possibly something other than what the eunuch expected to find. And so let me show you what I mean. These are some excerpts from Isaiah 53. This starts in verse 2. The prophet writes, "He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. As one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities." Verse 6, "And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted. Yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent. So he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him." Now, I don't know what pops into your mind when you think about a servant of God, but this text does not paint a pretty picture. This passage describes a figure who will come to make right all that sin has corrupted in our world and establish God's kingdom forever, what is popularly called the Messiah. But he sure doesn't seem to come as you would expect a savior king to come. God's servant apparently would be one to suffer. He would be given what he didn't deserve. His life would be crushed and humiliated and unjustly taken from him. And yet it says that this would be God's expressed purpose for him. It's an image that in many respects defies expectations for a king, any king, much less the Messiah, the Redeemer of God's people. In fact, while Isaiah 53 might describe a suffering servant, many Jews believe that the Messiah was supposed to come and be something else, that he was supposed to come and liberate them from their physical captors. In the minds of many, the Messiah was supposed to be a king who would come and topple systems and regimes of oppression like Rome and be the one to reestablish a geopolitical kingdom of Israel. A Messiah who would be despised and rejected? No way. A king without form and majesty? Yeah, right. A king who would willingly suffer injustice, a Messiah who would be crushed and killed according to God's plan? Get out of here. Can't be. Yet Jesus breaks onto the scene, fulfilling these words and more from Isaiah, proving himself to be the long-awaited Messiah. But he is not the type of king that many, including us, would expect. He comes as a servant. He comes as a sufferer. And understanding that this is who Jesus is, I believe, has all kinds of implications for those of us who would follow him. And that's what we're going to tease out for the next few weeks coming into Easter. But to begin with, we're going to look at Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45 that you just heard read. And it's a spot where Jesus exposes to his disciples just how different his kingship and his kingdom will be, how it might defy some of their expectations for what they can expect in life and what that means for them and subsequently what it means for us too. So let's pick up in Mark chapter 10. If you want to grab a Bible and turn there, that'd be absolutely fantastic. You can read along with me. But we'll pick up in verse 35. And this is what it reads. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "Well, what is it that you want? What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant to us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." All right, let's do a little bit of context work here just real quick. So James and John, these are two of Jesus's 12 disciples, guys he actually nicknamed elsewhere the Sons of Thunder, which as far as nicknames from Jesus go, you can sign me up for that one. That sounds absolutely awesome. But it actually fits who these guys were. They were bold and brash dudes. So before following Jesus, they were fishermen. They were hardworking, blue-collar guys, a little rough around the edges and a bit salty. Pun intended. And here they come to Jesus with just this signature frankness and say, "Jesus, we want you to do something for us." Like, have you ever had a friend with absolutely no shame? You know, the type of friend who is willing to ask you for things that no other polite person would actually ask you for. That's a bit of what we see happening here with James and John. They ask, "Grant us to sit at your right and at your left hand in your glory." For the record, this is an absolutely brazen request. They are asking Jesus that when he gets enthroned as king, they want to be his top two dudes. They want to have be the highest ranking officials in his proverbial cabinet. I mean, the audacity, am I right? They are essentially asking to be the two most important people in the kingdom outside of Jesus, positions of honor and prestige in Jesus' kingdom. They want Jesus to elevate them, so to speak, up the proverbial ladder. The move from fisherman to kingdom councilman, I think we will all admit, is quite the social move. Now, lest we're tempted to look at these sons of thunder and think, "Oh, bless their hearts. They just don't get it." I think we should just own the fact that we all kind of do the same thing, right? Like we're all kind of guilty and complicit in this. By that, I don't just mean that we all jockey for position and want to be esteemed above others. Like certainly some of us are that. Some of us gravitate to positions of honor and esteem and power. Whereas others of us, like we're just completely fine to live in obscurity as long as it doesn't come at the expense of maybe things like our convenience or comfort. Certainly that's one thing that's happening here, but it's not the only thing happening. What James and John are doing here is they are looking to Jesus, their leader, and they are wanting him, dare I even say, expecting him to take them where they want to go. So to kind of like paint the framework for you a little bit. So in 1960, television played the first major role in electing a US president. The presidential debates between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon were the first to be aired on TV. Now, those who listened to the radio thought Nixon was the clear winner. They thought Nixon came out clearly the one who had the best things to say. But those who watched the debates on TV said something altogether different. When they watched, what they saw was a tired-looking Nixon who had lost a significant amount of weight after a recent knee injury, which made his suit fit all kind of funny. He also refused to wear makeup on camera, which made him look very unflattering. Apparently, to the viewing audience, he looked old, tired, and kind of gaunt. Meanwhile, JFK, on the other hand, he had been campaigning in Southern California. He had a nice tan, he was young, he was fit. And even though the radio listeners confirmed that Nixon won the content of the debate, it didn't matter because JFK looked like a winner. And it taught political scientists something very important, that image matters. That as people, we are drawn to attractive, successful people who look like winners, people who make us think, I want to go where he's going to go. Wherever he's headed, I want to make sure I am headed in that direction as well. So when it comes to who we choose to follow, or even how we choose our friends, we look for people who can take us where we're trying to go, who project the type of image that I want to be associated with, or I want my country or organization or college football team, hypothetically speaking, to be known by, right? People who I perceive can help me get to the next level or climb whatever ladder it is that I am concerned with climbing to a better life. And this is part of what is happening with James and John. They've seen Jesus. They've heard his teaching. They've seen him perform miracles, and they're convinced that he is the king of God's kingdom. They see revolution and revival on the horizon, and they want to make sure that they've got good seats at that table. But notice verse 38, but Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you're asking." Listen, it is one thing to have a question that we don't know the answer to, right? And it's a whole other thing to be asking for something that you don't even understand what it would mean if you got what you were asking for. It reminds me of like when my kids, when they're always like, "Oh, Daddy, we just can't wait to grow up." I look at them and I'm like, "Oh, y'all, that's so cute. But you have no idea what you're saying. Like, are you ready for bills? You want bills? How about a mortgage? Does that sound good to you? Of course not. They think they know what they're asking, but they have no idea what they're saying. They think that growing up, all that really means is that you get to do what you want. And I hate to break it to them, but I'm like, listen, if that's your expectation, you have the wrong set of expectations. That's not how any of this is going to go. And my kids are 4 and 7, so they just look up at me and they're like, "Dad, you're so crazy." And then they run off and play, whatever it may be. But that's a bit of what Jesus is saying here. James and John have no idea what they're actually asking for. James and John have some wrong expectations of Jesus and his kingdom. And those wrong expectations are causing them to ask for things that they don't even know what it would mean if they got. He goes on, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" He's saying, hey guys, how you think this is going to go down is not actually how it's going to go down. My kingdom coming in glory is going to come by its king going to a cross. Essentially, Isaiah 53, that text is about me, guys. Are you ready to drink that cup? Are you ready to drink that cup? Are you ready for the baptism of fire that's coming for me as I absorb the sins of the world onto my body? For the record, Jesus had just told them that this was coming for him a few verses earlier, but the whole scenario almost reads like that information just went in one ear and right out the other for these sons of thunder. Verse 39, they replied, "We are able. Jesus, we're ride or die." Now it would be appropriate maybe to say, "Bless their hearts." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." For what it's worth, can you just imagine the look in his eye as he's saying this to James and John, knowing that eventually they will suffer for the gospel? That James will be the first one of the 12 disciples, the 12 apostles who is martyred for his faith. Knowing that John would be imprisoned and beaten and die in exile for the sake of Jesus' kingdom. And Jesus just responds, "Guys, you will do this, actually, but it's not even my role to grant these positions. Never mind that it's not your role to assume them." And then the rest of the disciples find out. Look at verse 41. When the 10 heard this, they began to be indignant with James and John, which makes a ton of sense. I mean, imagine being a fly on the wall for that car ride home. How are you going to ask Jesus to make you greater than us? Really? You're going to go to Jesus with this request? But the thing to note here is that their indignation is an indication that the rest of the disciples are just as confused as James and John when it comes to how things will work in Jesus' kingdom. Verse 42, so Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. He says, this is the way the rest of the world works. The way that you guys are thinking is how everybody else thinks, jockeying for title and position, believing that climbing the political or social or economic ladder or whatever it may be is the way up. Your expectations are off. My kingdom does not work. It does not operate like the rest of the world operates. And I think it's really interesting that he doesn't tell them not to pursue greatness. He doesn't tell them not to pursue it. He doesn't chastise them for being concerned about it. Rather, Jesus comes in with a completely different perspective about what makes somebody great than what they think does. Best example I can think of is middle school. Like if you want to take yourself back there for just a moment, like in middle school, myself and everyone thought that the greatest thing was being at the proverbial cool table at lunch. Like, do you remember this dynamic? You guys remember living in this space, kids jockeying for position to be in the in crowd, wearing the right brands. Like when I was there, was like this one specific pair of Timberlands. It's very hard to remember, but I think it was the Timberland Heritage Euro Hiker leather mid-height. Real hard to remember. But this is what we believed, that having these shoes said something about us. And everybody's trying to posture and say the right joke at the right time and go to all sorts of lengths to be accepted by this crowd because it meant so much to us. In our minds, it was the clear and obvious path to greatness. Now, as an adult, I see that whole scenario differently, right? I see that whole situation differently. I don't think middle school kids posturing and trying to be seen as cooler than others is all that great. In fact, I think it's kind of lame, to be honest. Now, no one at that table seems all that impressive to me, but if I saw a kid who was so self-assured and confident that they would pass up that cool table and instead look around the room for somebody perhaps sitting by themselves, somebody who was a little bit different, a little left out, and if they went out of their way to sit with that person, if I saw that middle school kid, I would say that is actual greatness. And that's Jesus's point here. He has a completely different perspective on what makes somebody great. He's painting a completely different picture. Greatness in his kingdom is not defined how the rest of the world defines it. He says that greatness is not going to be what you think it is, and it's not going to be, you're not going to pursue the same things in my kingdom that you would where the rest of the world does. Things are different where I am king. For lack of a better way of saying it, Jesus' kingdom is what I would call an upside down kingdom. Jesus' kingdom is an upside down kingdom. It doesn't value or operate like we would expect it to. In Jesus' kingdom, the way up is down because that's the way its king is crowned. Look at verse 45. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Whereas everyone else is climbing, whereas every other king comes to ascend, Jesus is the king who comes to descend, to serve, to give his life away for the good of others in love. One of my favorite passages about this we actually studied last summer. It's Philippians 2, verses 5-8. And here Paul reminds us in vivid detail of these things. He says, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. The pattern that Jesus, God in the flesh, sets before us is this pattern and posture of going lower and lower and lower. He descended to take on human form, being born in the likeness of men. I mean, think about that for a minute. Divinity itself clothed in human flesh, and all the wrinkles and cuts and scratches that come along with it, the yelp of a stubbed toe in the middle of the night, divinity with headaches and an achy lower back from walking from Samaria to Judea and back. And not just any human form, but the human form of a baby, a human baby born to an impoverished, unwed couple. His young life either mired in small town scandal or fleeing persecution as a refugee. This is how he came. And he goes lower still. He lives his life as an itinerant, homeless minister, teacher, living his life dependent on the generosity of strangers for food and provision. And he goes lower still. In his last hours before his death, he bends down to take a water bowl and wash the dirt and dung off his disciples' feet. Disciples who rarely understand what he's saying or doing, who fall asleep on the job, one of which who eventually betrays him, who sells him out for blood money. And Jesus knows this the whole time, and yet he picks up the servant's towel anyway. And yet he goes lower still, obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. You know, one of the perks of being God is supposed to be that you don't have to die. It's one of the perks. Yet Jesus forgoes this perk. He descends to human death, and not just any death, but one of the most torturous deaths in human history, a criminal's death, a despicable death, a death so horrific that you would look away from it even if it was happening to your worst enemy. Like, what kind of king is this? What kind of king is this? What kind of king have you ever heard of who would do such things as this? Kings send people out to die for them. Kings don't die for their people. In fact, Charles Colson, preaching in Russia, once said as much. He said, all throughout human history, as far back as recorded time and doubtless before, kings, princes, tribal chiefs, presidents, and dictators have sent their subjects into battle to die for them. Only once in human history has a king not sent his subjects to die for him, but instead died for his subjects. This is King Jesus. This is how he works. This is the king of God's kingdom. You see, the upside down kingdom has an upside down king. Jesus did not come with pomp or circumstance. He did not come with military power or might. No, Jesus came as a suffering servant. He came with sacrificial, self-giving love for the world. And I believe that it is just absolutely imperative that we see this and that we know that this is who Jesus is. For one, because you got to know that this is what Jesus came to do for you. This is what Jesus came to do for you. He laid down his life for you, that your sin, all of it, every amount of it, all the ways that you've chosen to do what you want over what he wants, all of the ways that you've chosen to redefine right and wrong for yourself and live outside of what God says is right, true, and good, that all of that wouldn't be held against you anymore. That when Jesus laid down his life, he took for you what your sin deserves, such that all of your guilt and all of your shame and all of your captivity to sin would be a thing of the past for you, so that it would no longer be the truest true thing about who you are, but he would take that and make you something new in him. That's what his sacrificial love offers to you. And to be quite honest with you, some of you need to come to him and receive it. Can I just put that out there for you? Some of you have never actually put your faith in him to take your sin from you, but you've been trying your best to make up for it on your own. You've been trying your best to prove yourself worthy to him instead of just coming and laying it down before him and saying, Jesus, you are my only hope. You got to wash me clean. I can't do this on my own. Some of you need to come and receive it, and you need to do it today. You need to take communion with us after the sermon, and you need to step into the waters of the baptismal pool at our next baptism gathering, because you need to come to Jesus and receive what his servant sacrificial love has to offer you. But the other reason that we got to know that this is who Jesus is because who you expect Jesus to be becomes what you expect from him. Who you expect Jesus to be becomes what you expect from him. As A.W. Tozer famously said, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Because who you understand him to be affects what you expect him to do. It affects what you expect him to provide. It affects the type of life you expect him to give you or to call you into. It affects how you think your experience of following him should go. I'll give you some low-hanging fruit as an example. Like sometimes we can come to Jesus thinking he's more of a prosperity bringer than a suffering servant. Now, to be sure, there is blessing and provision that God gives to his children through faith in Christ. And I would absolutely argue that following Jesus is a better way of life than anything else that is out there. But nowhere does God promise that any of that will mean things like health, wealth, ease, and comfort. In fact, he most often tells us to expect the opposite. But if this is who you expect Jesus to be, then this is the type of life you will expect from him. And the problem, of course, will be when he doesn't deliver on what you think you were promised. And while I don't suspect that many of us are tempted to think that about Jesus in the extreme, I think we would be lying to ourselves if we didn't sometimes live with a tamer version of it. A belief that if I'm just a good and faithful Christian, my life will probably go pretty well. I'll get a good spouse, a decent job, and I'll have minimal problems. God will keep my kids from making dumb decisions. He'll give them families of their own that I can visit when I retire, and I'll die naturally in my sleep at a good old age after I've accomplished everything that I wanted to accomplish. And sure, hear me, I hope that happens for you. I do. But it might not. And if you aren't aware that this is how you're approaching Jesus, it can lead to all kinds of bitterness when your life doesn't go how you hoped it would. All kinds of frustration and disappointment when that phone call comes. All kinds of righteous indignation when your relationships or your parenting or whatever else is more difficult and requires more of you than you thought or expected it to do. So hear me. I don't know how your life is going to go, but I can tell you one thing. That if Jesus' kingdom is an upside-down kingdom with an upside-down king, a king who comes to us as a suffering servant, then we should expect that following him will look much the same. That following Jesus will be upside down for us too. Like Jesus says here, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. Or even more bluntly, like he puts it in Luke 14:27, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. His upside down, sacrificial, self-giving love is not only our salvation, but our example and our motive and our call. There's a reason why we opted to start the series on Serve the City weekend. There's a reason for that. Because Serve the City is just this fantastic little snapshot of the upside downness of following King Jesus. Over the past few days, 350 to 400 of our members across our family of churches have been serving the least of these in our city, doing humble, hard, unpopular work. Lots of us working in the dirt, doing sweaty work, behind the scenes, unnoticed, unpraised work. Like outside of this plug right now and a fun recap video next week, most of you will never get credit for the hours that you served this week. Not here on earth anyway. But these things are emblematic of our King Jesus. And he calls it greatness. He says, this is what it looks like and what it means to be great in my kingdom. Not by climbing, not by trying to get our own, not by putting ourselves first, but by joining Jesus on the way down, by going lower and lower and lower with him. And so as we follow Jesus, the call for us is to look for the way down, to look for the way down at our jobs, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, to be asking the question, where can I give my life away in love for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of those around me? Where can I live upside down like my upside down king? There's a young woman in our family of churches named Molly. And she's a relatively young single professional, but she's also a foster parent and currently fostering her second infant child. Now, fostering any child, as some of you know, is a taxing endeavor, even for a married couple, much less a single professional with an infant. To boot, the baby she's been caring for is somewhat medically fragile and has been in and out of the hospital and has even required surgery while in her care. I mean, can you just imagine what that would be like for a young professional single woman? And it's a really beautiful thing she's doing. And I know that many of you in here are foster parents and you have experienced similar situations, but I share her story to draw out the fact that she chose this. She chose this. She has chosen to bring all kinds of pain and difficulty into her life that she didn't have to. She never had to pick that. When no one would bat an eye, if she just was primarily concerned with building her career or finding a spouse and building a biological family of her own, when no one would bat an eye at those things, she instead chose something different. She chose to sacrifice her time and energy and money in a way that no one would have ever demanded of her, in a way that no one would have ever said that she needed to do. But she chose it all the same because she was looking for a way down. She was looking how she might go lower and lower. And she was looking that way because she knows the king who did the exact same thing for her. I think she's a wonderful example of the mentality and what it might look like if we were to embody this ethic of King Jesus. And so look, I don't know what kind of expectations you started with on your spiritual journey. My guess would be that there are many of us here who, like the disciples before us, started with some really off expectations of Jesus. Maybe you expected him to keep your life free of hardship or to bring you to a certain place in life or to have you and your faith always at the proverbial cool kids table of society. And maybe you've followed Jesus for some time, and over time, those false expectations have been exposed, and you've had to realize that Jesus never actually said those things. He never actually promised those things to you, and that's not the type of king that he is. What's amazing, though, among whatever disillusionment and disenchantment we may feel on these fronts, we are afforded the exact same experience as James and John before us. We are afforded the exact same opportunity to see Jesus for who he really is. To see Jesus for who he really is, a suffering servant king who laid down his life on our behalf, and to have our view of him rebuilt from the ground up, starting with the cross, that we too might be a people who are moved by his love in such a way to join him in going lower and lower and lower to greatness. Because this is who God is, an unexpected, upside-down king of an unexpected, upside-down kingdom. And by his grace, may we as his people become the same.